is my strength. Is there danger? Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Foul name. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Justice is come.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Light is my strength. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Foul name. You are past redemption. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. For my father, the king. You are past redemption. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Justice is come. You are past redemption. For my father, the king. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. For Lord Orion. Of course. Foul name. You are past redemption. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice is come. Feel my wrath. Of course. You are past redemption. Justice is come.
First blood.
Certainly. Of course. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. You are past redemption. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Justice is come. Certainly. A sound plan. Foul name. For honor. Of course. You are past redemption. A sound plan. Justice has come. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Foul. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound. Of course. Justice is come. For honor. A sound. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. I'm here to help.
My light
Justice shall be done. Is there danger? The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Iran. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan. You are past again. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Is there danger? Of course. For honor.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies'
Strength.
town needs help.
I stand for the light. Justice shall be done. Of course. The light is my A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Foul. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
Of course.
Our warriors have engaged
Of
the
course.
enemy.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Our allies' town needs
A
help.
sound plan. Certainly.
Our warriors have
Justice
engaged
shall
the
be
enemy.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For Lord Iran. Certainly.
Your
Of
man.
course. A sound plan. Is there danger? I'm here to help. For honor. Is there danger? I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Is there danger? For honor. A sound. shall be done. Light is my strength. Feel my wrath. Justice is come. Of course. You are past me. Is there danger or honor? I'm here to help. Of course. The light is my strength. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger?
Our warriors have engaged
Of
the
course.
enemy.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength.
Our
I'm here
allies'
to
town
help.
needs help.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help.
Can I help
The
you?
light is my strength. A sound. I'm here to help. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
Betrayer of light. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. Is there danger? I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. Of course. I wish all justice. Of course. Justice is come. For Lord Oran. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Dominating.
Certainly. Here to help. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan.
Mega kill. Double kill.
For honor. Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan. I stand where there should be blood still. Is there danger? I stand ready. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. You are past me.
Our warriors have engaged the
Of
enemy.
course. Certainly. Light is my strength. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor.
Your mana is depleted.
A sound plan. Justice. I'm here to help. For honor. Is there a sound plan? Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Our
A sound
warriors have
plan.
engaged the
For
enemy.
honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For
Our
honor.
allies' town needs
Certainly.
help.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Killing spree. Double kill.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Killing spree. Double kill. Killing spree.
Of course. Certainly. Justice. A sound plan. I bow to you. A sound plan.
Mega kill. Own
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I bidding. Is there danger?
it. Own it.
Justice shall be done. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Betrayal. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Double kill.
Justice shall be done. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For honor. Of course. Justice is come. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
Unstoppable.
I stand for the light.
Own
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly.
Killing spree.
The light is my strength.
it.
I'm here to help. I stand for the light. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor.
Our warriors have
Dominating.
For honor.
Wicked sick.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Is there danger? For honor. Betrayer of the light. Stand for the light. Of course. You are past me. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. What is your wish? Is my aim. I stand for the light. For honor. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Of course.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
A sound plan.
Mega kill.
Certainly. I stand for honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Light. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Where shall justice shall be done? A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Yes, my friend. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Of course. A sound. Certainly. Of course. A sound. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Unstoppable!
Of course. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Prayer of the light. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For Lord Oran. A sound plan.
Wicked sick!
The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Double kill. Ownage.
Light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. A sound. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for honor. Justice shall be done. Of course.
Greetings, my lord.
Light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. Light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Killing
Of course.
spree.
I bow to you. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Certainly. For honor.
Mega kill.
Initiating shutdown sequence. Welcome.